So I'm going to start with someone who is really why we're even having this conversation here today. And many of you know him, and it is absolutely disgraceful that our country is so scared of people who speak truth to power that this brilliant man has been banned from entering our country. And one day we will have a new president. And he will also be making history, by the way, because our new president will be the first Jewish American president that this country has ever seen. And then Mr. Omar Barghouti will be welcomed into these United States of America with open arms. Omar Barghouti is a founding committee member of the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. He's also a co-founder of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. He has received the Gandhi Peace Award in 2017. He's probably one of the most peaceful men you've ever met in your life, contrary to everybody else in the opposition. But I'm very proud to be on the stage here, and still my heart is heavy to know that he couldn't be here in person with all of us to share this moment. But I would love to give him the opportunity to share his wise words with us before we start the rest of this panel. Thank you, UMass-Amherst, for having me here again, and I hope to be back.
Greetings from Palestine. I hope everyone can hear me. This last April, the Trump administration banned me from entering the US, as was mentioned, without providing a reason. Given my regular travel to the US for many years, this ban seems to be an ideologically and politically motivated measure that fits in with Israel's escalating repression against human rights defenders. Israel's far-right regime is not merely continuing its decades-old military occupation, settler colonialism, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing against Palestinians. It's increasingly outsourcing its anti-democratic tactics to the US. They've tried to silence my voice, but here I am. Their McCarthyite repression has failed. As Israel becomes a role model for far-right, xenophobic, or authoritarian leaders across the world, from Trump and Salvini to Orban, and from Bolsonaro and Modi to Mohammed bin Salman, the BDS movement for Palestinian rights has become a significant partner in a growing international progressive wave, fighting for global justice against the forces of fascism, xenophobia, and savage neoliberalism. Gaza is under attack again today. But even before the horror of Israel's full-blown bombing, from the start of the Great March of Return in 2018 to end Israel's brutal siege and assert the right of return for Palestinian refugees, Israeli army snipers have implemented what Human Rights Watch calls a premeditated shoot to kill or maim policy, slaughtering dozens and injuring thousands of peaceful Palestinians, including children, medics, journalists, and people with disabilities. UN investigators have recently concluded that Israel's acts in Gaza, quote, may constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity, unquote. Israel's 12-year-old siege of Gaza has in fact included counting the per capita calories that are allowed in to keep the 2 million Palestinians there on the brink of starvation, as was admitted by Israeli officials. It has reduced Gaza into not just a prison camp, as former British Prime Minister David Cameron once described it, but into an unlivable territory by 2020. That's around the corner, according to the United Nations. In parallel to its televised rolling massacre in Gaza, Israel's land-grabbing construction of illegal settlements and its gradual ethnic cleansing, especially in occupied Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley, and the Naqab, are accelerating. Its relentless home demolitions, arrest and torture of children, and apartheid walls are designed to make our lives so bitter that we would transfer ourselves as one honest Israeli minister once admitted. South Africa's Speaker of Parliament, Ms. Baleka Mbete, said, quote, "Apartheid in South Africa was a picnic compared to what we have seen in the occupied Palestinian territories," end quote. This is what the ongoing Nakba looks like in 2019. With the unparalleled support for its fanatic policies by the Trump administration and the shameful complicity of the EU, Israel has become so drunk with impunity and colonial arrogance that it is dropping its thin, worn-out mask of democracy. It is shedding the veneer of accepting even a Palestinian Bantustan and cheering the Trump era of global bullying as a rare opportunity to bury for good the Palestinian right to self-determination. Yet, we're not asking for charity. We're asking for responsibility, accountability, and solidarity. Solidarity levels the playing fields with the colonizers and gives us hope, which is resilient and contagious. This is precisely why Israel is desperately trying to suppress the nonviolent BDS movement for Palestinian rights. As a key part of Palestinian popular nonviolent resistance and the most effective and hopeful form of international solidarity with our struggle for emancipation. Launched in 2005 by the broadest coalition in Palestinian society, BDS calls for three rights: ending Israel's 1967 occupation, ending its institutionalized system of racial segregation and discrimination, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, and upholding the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homeland. BDS is deeply rooted in decades of Palestinian popular resistance to settler colonialism, and it's inspired and strongly influenced by the South African anti-apartheid movement and the US civil rights movement. Americans have a long and honorable history of using boycotts for social, political, and economic justice causes against the Montgomery Bus Company, California grape growers, the states of North Carolina and Arizona over anti-LGBT and anti-immigrant laws, respectively, and now against Trump's racist agenda. Similarly, Palestinians seek to use peaceful economic and cultural leverage to achieve our liberation. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, BDS has consistently and categorically opposed all forms of racism and racial discrimination, including anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism, sexism, and anti-LGBT discrimination, among others. One's identity, the movement upholds, should never diminish one's entitlement to rights. BDS targets complicity, not identity. Since there is nothing Jewish about Israel's crimes against Palestinians, there is nothing inherently anti-Jewish then about a nonviolent, morally consistent human rights struggle to end this system of oppression. As Israel shifts steadily to the far right, forging alliances with xenophobic, racist, and patently anti-Semitic forces in the US, Europe, Brazil, India, and elsewhere, and simultaneously, as the impact of BDS continues to rise, Israel's popularity is declining worldwide. In this context, US defenders of Israel's human rights violations have desperately invested massive political and financial resources in the last few years to suppress speech on Palestinian rights and demonize BDS. Through intimidation, spying, and weaponizing claims of anti-Semitism, they're trying to keep Israel, quote, on a pedestal, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa once said, above accountability and beyond censure. At the root of the mushrooming false claims of anti-Semitism flying about is a desperate attempt by Israel and its supporters to promote a new anti-Palestinian definition of anti-Semitism that, quote, serves to shield Israel from being held accountable to universal standards of human rights and international law, as stated last year by more than 40 progressive Jewish groups worldwide led by Jewish Voice for Peace. Daniel Blattman, a prominent Israeli Holocaust expert and chief historian of the Warsaw Ghetto Museum, was even more blunt in his criticism of this new anti-Semitism definition, especially after the German parliament declared BDS to be anti-Semitic. He said, "That is how a country where anti-Semitism was a political tool that contributed to the rise of the Nazis' murderous enterprise became a country that promotes distortion of anti-Semitism as a tool to facilitate the political persecution of a nonviolent BDS movement that fights the occupation, the oppression of the Palestinians, and the war crimes Israel perpetrates in the territories," end of quote. As reported in the Israeli daily Haaretz last February, the Israeli government faced criticism for hosting the prime ministers of the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, who the paper describes as being accused of being anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic. In response, a Likud member of parliament, Ms. Anat Berko, defended Israel's current attitude towards anti-Jewish racism, saying, and please listen carefully, she said, quote, "They might be anti-Semites, but they are on our side," end of quote. Given all this, Israel's far-right regime is evidently in no position to accuse anyone of anti-Semitism. Israel's fraudulent anti-Semitism smears against human rights defenders in the anti-racist BDS movement sound as credible as Trump's environmental protection credentials. While defending our freedom of expression and being vigilant against all forms of racism, including real anti-Jewish racism, we're intensifying our campaigns to further multiply the impact of our BDS movement. We're strengthening our principled and intersectional alliances with global movements for racial, indigenous, social, economic, gender, and climate justice. As Angela Davis always reminds us, justice is indivisible. BDS tactics have been adopted by a number of US mainline churches, student governments in tens of universities, academic associations, racial and social justice groups, and many artists. Trade unions and political parties across the world are also adopting pressure tactics against Israel. Just a few weeks ago, the UK Trade Union Congress, representing millions of working people in Britain, voted for ending military trade with Israel and to pressure corporations to end complicity in its violations, and so did the British Labour Party. In May, instead of attracting the anticipated 40,000 to 50,000 tourists to flood Tel Aviv, the Eurovision Song Contest attracted a mere 5,000 visitors. Over 100 LGBTQ groups in Europe and many prominent artists joined our call to boycott the contest in apartheid Tel Aviv. In response to these and thousands of other indicators of the growing impact of BDS, Israel and its far-right allies worldwide have intensified their global war on the BDS movement, including extensive propaganda, legal warfare, and espionage. Israel has dedicated an anti-BDS government ministry, a whole ministry, to desperately establish, to fight BDS, and it desperately established a tarnishing unit, that's the official name, a tarnishing unit, to smear Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights defenders in the BDS movement. As a co-founder of this movement, I've had my share of this smearing and repression. Israel has imposed arbitrary travel bans on me over the last 5 years, including in 2018, when I was prevented from traveling to Jordan to accompany my late mother during cancer surgery. Israel's intelligence minister threatened me in 2016 with, quote, targeted civil elimination, drawing condemnation from Amnesty. And I'm far from alone. There have always been attempts to muzzle Palestinian voices, but wherever we live, at home or in exile, Palestinians remain steadfast in our commitment to fight not only repression and McCarthyism, but also apartheid and settler colonialism. Solidarity with Palestine today means intensifying pressure to end the complicity of the US government, corporations, and institutions in enabling Israel's system of oppression. That's hardly charitable. That's a profound moral obligation to do no harm. This includes cutting the billions of dollars in military aid to Israel as part of shifting US priorities from militarization and global domination to investing in health, education, sustainable jobs, protecting the environment, and reparations for Native Americans and for Black Americans. To end Israel's regime of oppression and its anti-Palestinian authoritarian allies fear our shining a light of truth that reveals their lies. They dread our tireless quest for justice and equality. They loathe our love for freedom and our insistence on nothing less than an existence with dignity and the full menu of rights, to borrow from South African leader Desmond Tutu. United, we shall and must prevail over all oppression. Thank you.